Hello and welcome to 949 Racing and SuperMiata. Today we're going to talk about the differences between one-piece and two-piece shocks, about choosing high-performance shocks or high-performance suspension upgrades for your production car. That's sort of the context here. And there's a lot of confusion between the two-piece and one-piece shocks and what the differences are and what the trade-offs are. So I wanted to try to clarify that. And a lot of people have done some good videos out there. This isn't the only video about this subject. If you want to learn more, kind of poke around YouTube and you'll see some other good videos on the subject. But I wanted to do my own as it relates to our particular products and kind of the questions that we get here when people call us in and ask us about these shocks. So first, let's just identify what the different types of shocks are. So a one-piece shock is your basic, it's kind of like an OEM shock. The difference is it's a high-performance racing shock. So one piece refers to basically the body. It doesn't refer to the other bits. It's basically the body, and then the end of the body. Of course, this is an open cylinder because you got to assemble the thing. And the cap is part of the shock. So the cap here basically closes off the cylinder. So, and in most cases, the cap is actually part of the mount, typically to save space, so that you've got, this is where basically where the body is going to sit. You've got nitrogen and oil volume all the way up to the very end. There's no wasted space, and if you unscrew this cap, the oil comes out. That's the end of the shock, and there's no extra adapters needed to get it to fit the car. Two-piece shock is going to be, and I say two-piece, it's actually often they're multi-piece shock. A two-piece shock is going to be a cartridge that's, the shock companies that make these kind of two-piece shocks, they don't have they don't make specific cartridges just for cars. What they have is a few 4 or 5 cartridges in kind of generic lengths, like a 200 millimeter length, a 250, a 300, and a 350 maybe. And they take those cartridges and they put an adapter on them. That's where you get the two-piece. So you've got the cartridge, which is sealed here, and that's the entire shock cartridge. It doesn't actually attach to the car. And then you have a separate adapter. And these are going to come out of a catalog too. They'll have they'll have an eye mount, they'll have the fork mount, they'll have a pin mount, and they'll have a couple of different sizes. Like this is one machined piece, I think. Is there a seam there? No, I take that back. This is 2 pieces. There's actually a seam there. So there's a cylinder and then the eye. These cylinders probably come in different lengths out of the catalog, and then you have the eye. And the companion shock to this one here, that's the rear. The companion to this particular Chinese two-piece shock is this guy here. And I say two-piece, it's actually got the cartridge. There's your first piece, and that should be the whole shock. It should just have a mount attached to the bottom of it. But what you've got here is the preload collar, a locking collar, a jam nut, a cylinder, a flare adapter, and a flange here. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different pieces. And the interesting is, we think, well, it's all shock in there, isn't it? Well, actually, it's not. Do I have a... It's basically hollow in there. This is just, it's just empty space. There's no actual shock in there. The shock actually ends where this painter's tape is. And what's interesting, compared this to our shock for the same application, this happens to be for the second generation Miata. Our shock, as you can see, it's a little bit longer because this is the full travel shock. This is 90 millimeters of travel, and this is 126 millimeters of travel. Theirs is a little shorter, so it's going to have less juke travel. And the cylinder on this, the actual shock casing on this, is about 230 millimeters, and ours is about 335. So that's basically, I don't know, that's roughly 30% more cylinder. That's more oil volume, that's more nitrogen volume, and more critically, it's more stroke. When the cylinder is shorter, you can only fit so much shock shaft in there, so you end up with a shorter shock shaft. And when you shorten the cylinder, you have to shorten the shock shaft more than you shorten the cylinder. It's not equal. So in other words, if you pull 10 millimeter out of the cylinder, you don't pull 10 millimeter out of the shaft. It might be 12 or 15 millimeter. The reason why is pressure balancing when the shock. And now that's a subject of a whole other video. That's kind of a more super shock nerdy type of subject. But it has to do with essentially when you push the shaft down, you've got the piston that's pushing down inside of the shock. And it's pushing the oil, and the oil is basically moving through, so it's not taking up any more space. However, the shaft itself is taking up space that wasn't already taken up, so it's displacing that oil and pushing that oil down and compressing that floating piston in there that's in between that and the nitrogen, your high-pressure gas, and it's compressing that nitrogen. Well, that nitrogen can only compress a certain amount before it starts to affect the damping adversely. So what you end up when you have these really short shocks that are a lot shorter than they need to be, especially when you're on the stiffer damping settings and you're putting high pressure through the shock. It's hard to say through the shock. Um, it's harder to get the shock tuned properly. The more shock volume you have, the easier it is to get a really high damping force without any hysteresis. Hysteresis is essentially it's springiness, it's memory. Literally, it's what it means. And in a shock, it's when if you take the spring off, you push the shock down. It should have a damping resistance, and when you stop, it should just sit there. Hysteresis is when the shock doesn't actually put oil through the piston, but it just compresses the nitrogen, and then the nitrogen springs back, and there's no damping, so it acts like a spring. So your shock is kind of doing this thing where it's not damping, it's just acting like a spring. It's a very, very small movement, but essentially the smaller the volume of oil and nitrogen, and the worse the pressure balancing in the shock, the more likely you are to have that problem. That is why Pro Motorsports shocks are all one-piece shocks. What's interesting is that the very best two-piece coilovers, and those are kind of the hot-rodded ones coming from Taiwan. You've got Japan and the kind of the cheap ones that come from China. These are Chinese shocks, and then you're also seeing them from Vietnam and Thailand and places like that. But the highest end two-piece coilovers, the most exotic ones you can get, they're barely $2,000. They barely break $2,000, and they stop there. So you might ask yourself, if these are so awesome, how come there aren't $6,000 shocks? Well, if you go to a company like Tractive or Moton or Penske or Multimatic or JRZ, and you have a Porsche and you're looking for a three-way adjustable remote reservoir shock with billet mounts, those are like 12 grand, 10 grand. And our Zetas, we only make one single adjustable Zeta for the NC platform, for example. That's what I have on the table here. That's the second generation Miata. It's a $3,000 set of coilovers, and we make a lot of them at once, so we actually kind of discount them. It should be, if you just had one custom set made from, say, if you went to a Penske dealer and asked them to replicate this, you're going to spend about 5 grand, 4 or 5 grand for them, because they're only making one set. We do them in volume, that's why we can do them for 3 grand. But that's like the entry level of a Pro Motorsport shock. But these, the two-piece shocks, they're typically, $600 to maybe $1,300. That's kind of the price window. And you see these on Amazon and eBay. And these are also commonly known. You may have heard the term Alibaba Shocks. The reason they're called Alibaba Shocks is the companies that make these, they don't have any platform-specific engineering. They don't have engineers that actually go test drive the cars or anything. They'll make whatever shock you want in whatever color you want. And literally, you just send them a logo and send them a Pantone color, and they'll make you a shock in whatever color with whatever graphic you want. And that's why a lot of times when you look on eBay and you're looking for coilovers for your car, whether it's a Mustang or a Corolla or a Toyota Sienna or a Miata or whatever it is, and you'll see like 4 or 5 different brands, and they all kind of look similar. In fact, 2 or 3 of them look identical. They're just slightly different price, and the colors and the brand is different. It's like, well, they actually are the same shock. In fact, there's a good chance that almost all of them come from the same factory, or they're copies of a copy of a copy of a copy. The original design for the two-piece shocks goes back to Japan in the 90s, and the whole the magazine tuner industry. Those little companies wanted to be able to do a coilover without having to make special parts. So when you do a special shock like this, these are all custom-made parts just for the application. It's a shop like us, 949 Racing, the SuperMiata, that does all the kinematic studies, develops the damping profile. We design our own mounts. I don't know if I showed you that. Our own billet coaxial mounts. So we do all the work to design the shock, have them made, and have all these special parts made, and then we do a big production run of these parts. These kind of shocks, the Japanese companies, in order to make them less expensive, they just have like 4 cartridges, maybe 5 different cartridges in a couple different lengths, and then they have these parts, well, we call these Lego shocks, because it's like a part, and a part, and you pick different things out of a catalog, you put it together, and it sort of fits a car, and it actually even looks like a real race shock. But these are $900 a set, and these are $3,000 a set, and there couldn't be more different. You've got a beat up Ford Focus, and you've got a Porsche GT3 here. It's entirely different animals. So the reason these are exist is cost and the ability to bring something to market quickly without having to develop anything or do any testing or to make any special parts. You can just pull stuff off of a shelf, mix and match, and boom, you've got something. That's why I call them Lego shocks. And additionally, you know, for track days especially, when you're putting a lot of heat and you're doing continuous use, these run hotter. You've got the inner cylinder and then you've got the outer cylinder. It's basically like an insulating blanket that having that second piece there does not make it run cooler, it makes it run hotter. And you think, oh, my shocks don't run hot. Well, actually they do. If you were to put a tape sticker or an IR gun on them, they actually, on a hot day, if you live in the south somewhere, you're running, you know, on a 100-degree day or something, shocks get really hot. And that affects the life of the shock. And a lot of these, the stuff that comes from Asia, they pretty much never have synthetic fluid in them. It's basically a conventional oil, which is going to break down a little quicker because it's running hotter. So those shocks are just not going to work as well. They're not going to last as long. You go to your motorsport shocks, like all the other brands I mentioned earlier, and they're all using synthetic fluid, much higher shock volume. They have a fully exposed body, so they're running much cooler. Just apples and oranges, completely different animal. So what's the use case for the two-piece shock? Why do these exist? Well, obviously it's a cost thing. So there's a use case, and I think it's fair to say that for some people this might be the best solution. But you shouldn't go into it thinking, well, I want to get the best shock, I just don't want to spend a lot of money. Well, it's, you know, you pick two. It's always, you know, the quality, the durability, and the cost kind of thing. You can't get all of it. You can't get the best possible shock and only spend $1,000. I've already pointed out that the good high performance shocks, you know, those of you watching this, you know, there might be somebody out there who owns a Porsche or a newer BMW or something and has bought a set of triple adjustable Pro Shocks, and yeah, you know what they cost. They're $6-8 grand, and they're worth every penny. Real shocks do cost more money. I'm sorry to say it. That's, you know, that's the current state of affairs. Is to get a pro motorsports level shock tuned by a platform specific specialist, someone who knows that platform and optimizes the shock. They're just going to cost more. So the use case for this is if you're on a tight budget, and some people, you know, I know guys who can afford whatever they want, and they got multiple cars, they just don't like spending money on the cars. That's fine too, but whatever you decide what your budget is. But if you're willing to make the sacrifices in performance, you don't need them to ride well, you don't want the absolute best handling on track. What you're trying to do is lower the car. That's one of the main reasons to do a two-piece shock, because they're short. They're going to lower it whether you like it or not, because they usually can't even raise them up. They're low or slammed, and that's usually only two ride heights. So if you want to lower the car and you want to add damping so it's not wallowing around, so you want it to be a little stiffer, and with this kind of shock, you're going to give up compliance. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. Never going to be as good as a shock that has the full range of travel. It's physically impossible, because you can't take this much stroke and make it do the work of a shock that does this. You have to, and that's the kind of we'll get into the feature of adjustable length. But essentially, you're always going to have a bit of a compromise. So if you're okay with that compromise, you just want to not spend a lot and be able to lower the car, these work. But don't fool yourself. If you're looking for the best possible performance, you just basically Lego shocks and you just push them aside. You don't even start there. Buy once, cry once. Find a specialist in your platform, whether it's a Miata or a BMW or a Mustang or whatever. Find a specialist, and there's a lot of good specialists around the country. And that specialist usually won't have a line of shocks. They won't have 9 different shocks. Typically, the people who are really doing good platform development, they'll have picked one. They're like, we just do Nitron, or we just do Penske, or doing like we do Tractive, for example. Find a specialist, and typically they've already done the math. They've already got a really good shock package. You're like, ooh, wow, those are like 3 times the cost of the two-piece. Trust me. Pull the trigger on those bad boys. You'll be happy you did. Buy once, cry once. So that's a one-piece versus two-piece. And the two-piece, again, they have their use case if you simply don't want to spend the money. Frankly, my opinion, I don't think it's ever worth spending more than about $1,300 on these. There's no reason to spend $2 grand on a set of two-piece coilovers, because that's the beginning of the real motorsport shocks. We have kits that start around $2 grand. And I've seen good motorsports level shocks starting at like $2,800 for other platforms, for, you know, other cars. And to me, it's like that extra $600-800. It's night and day difference from what these are capable of. Spend the extra money. But if you know, if you're looking for a bare bones setup and you're going to spend less than $1,300 and maybe you're not going to keep the car, or it's just that's the budget, then yeah, go ahead and do these. But don't expect these to operate the same as a one-piece shock. The other thing to think about when trying to make a comparison between a two-piece and a one-piece shock, besides there aren't any expensive ones available. There are no pro teams using two-piece shocks. And by pro team, I mean a company that their business is actually getting sponsors, building a car, hiring a driver, and competing in a professional series where they're actually getting paid prize money and there's sponsorships involved. Their job is to go win races. They don't buy two-piece shocks. They don't build these. These are not seen in professional motorsports. There's a reason that these aren't used there. It's because they're less functional. And again, the cost thing, since there are no high-end two-piece coilovers, a high-end, again, might be $2,000 at the very, very top end. Most of them are like $1,500, and that in the world of motorsports, that's not high end. That's a street shock. So know what you're getting into. Be realistic about your expectations. So the one-piece shock, there's actually a good use case. Is that going to stand up? It's not. This is a good use case for the OEM shock. An OEM style shock. This is a Bilstein, but most of your factory shocks are not monotubes. They're twin tubes and they're steel. They're going to have a proprietary spring on them. So usually you can't put a race spring on these, and we don't recommend doing the conversions where you put the little sleeve on there and put race springs on them. Stick with an OEM spring, maybe a lowering spring. The use case for these is when you don't want to lower it, or maybe like a ½ inch at most. But if you really want to go low, don't go with the OEM coilover. This is OEM shock. It's a bad choice. If you're not going to lower it, and the prime thing is A, to not spend any money on it, and ride quality. You're not after making the car faster or maximum handling or maximum grip. If you are, then you want to get a proper one-piece coilover. If all you're trying to do is make it ride well and maybe lower to ½ inch and really not get any handling or performance improvement, then the OEM shocks are a good way to go. That's going to be your least expensive option in most cases. So I wanted to talk about the preload thing. You see on social media, they offer the ride height adjustments separate from spring preload as a feature. It's not a feature, it's a limitation. I'll explain in a minute. So essentially, any car, so if you're going to have, let's say this is a control arm, and this is the tire, and this is the subframe. So let's say the bottom here, that's the maximum droop travel that the car leaves with the factory, and up here at about 45 degrees, that's the maximum bump travel. And for a race car, you want to get maximum bump travel. That's always the most important for performance and being able to lower the car. And for droop travel, and most times for a performance use, you can afford to give up a little bit of droop travel, but you still want to be able to droop and go down past the static ride height. Like this is parked, and you can have some droop. You need to have some droop for the car to work over curbs and stuff, even on a racetrack. You can afford to give up a little bit, but not a lot. Now the two-piece coilover, we'll start with the OEM. The OEM is going to have that full range. The race coilover is typically going to have a little bit less droop, but still have a lot of droop. And it'll either have OEM bump travel, or typically, if it's done by a platform specialist, it'll actually have more bump travel than stock, and that's desirable. Now, the two-piece coilovers, because it's a short shock and a short shaft, they have a limited total range. So you kind of have to choose, well, like I want all the bump travel, but then I won't have droop. You know, it's, in fact, this is actually pretty common. We've had several cars in here, not just Miatas, but other cars where it had a two-piece coilover on it, and we lift it up on the hoist, and the wheel, instead of going like this, like it does from the factory, it goes like this, and it's like static ride height. And we're looking at the wheel, it's like tucked, and it's completely at full droop. There's no droop travel. And basically, when you set the car on the ground, it goes like this, so it's got this like, you know, an inch of droop travel. So every little bump you do, the wheels come up off the ground, and the car is kind of skipping around because it's topping out all the time. And that's with limited bump travel. So you go, well, I want all the droop travel. So you adjust it down so you have the droop travel with your two-piece coilover, but then you have no bump travel. You have like less bump travel than stock. So it's bottoming constantly. You're like, can't get them adjusted right. Welcome to two-piece coilovers. That's what you get. That's the world of those. So the preload isn't really affecting that. So if you have a shock that has that full range of travel that you want, you're always going to have that regardless of how much preload you have. So in other words, if you have a lot of preload or little, all it's doing is basically raising or lowering the car. It's not changing the amount of bump travel. You're not going to have any more bump travel. If the tire hits the fender, you can't have more bump travel than that. If your shock is optimized so the tire already goes up and just about hits the fender, stops just short of that, you don't want more and you don't need more. But if it's a one-piece coilover that's designed for the car, then that never changes. All you're doing is say, well, I want to run at this ride height or that ride height, but you still always have the same bump travel and you still have the same droop travel. You're just choosing your ride height. With the two-piece coilover, you have to choose a range. You say, well, I can only use this range or this range or this range. So it's a limitation having a two-piece coilover. And the idea that spring preload is somehow having adverse effect on the shock, it doesn't change anything. Springs have the same spring rate, whether they're half compressed or fully open, it doesn't matter. Preload is literally just that. You're taking a spring and you're preloading it. So if you have a car that's up on the hoist and it's full droop and the springs are free, there's no preload on them, you have zero preload. When you drop the car down on the ground, the weight of the car compresses the spring, and now you have preload. Preload is literally just whatever weight is on that shock. And then once it's setting with the car on the ground, you've got a little bit of preload on it, you say, well, I need to be a little higher. So you add your preload in your preload collar and you add some more preload and it raises the car up. It's not a bad thing. It's still the same spring rate. The shock still has the same bump travel and everything. The only problem is if you have a two-piece shock that now that you've got preload in it and got where you want it, you've run out of a bump travel, and then you have to adjust your shock to get your bump travel back, which you wouldn't have to do with the one-piece shock. So the whole preload's a bad thing. Preload is not a bad thing. Preload is just how heavy your car is. That's really all it is. It's if you have no weight on the car, you have no preload. If you have a really heavy car, you have a lot of preload. In fact, here when we're developing shocks, we refer to preload when John and I are going back and doing design work on this stuff. We refer to it in pounds. It's pounds of preload, because if you've got a 600-pound spring and we've got it compressed 2 inches, that's 1,200 pounds of preload. So we don't talk about millimeters. I got this many preloads. It's just weight of the car, however heavy or light the car is. So preload is not a bad thing. It's not the devil. It's not something. And again, this is coming from a motorsports perspective. There's no reason to be afraid of changing the preload as long as you have full travel. But if you don't have full travel, then yes, you should be afraid of preload, and that only comes with the two-piece shock where you have limited travel. So hopefully that answers most of your questions about one-piece, two-piece, and OEM-style shocks, and preload, and ride height, and all that kind of stuff. If you have more questions about Zetas, give us a call, shoot us an email. We're here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 Pacific time. Actually, calling is great. We actually prefer phone calls over emails because it's much easier to transfer the information that way. And I think that covers it. We will see you at the track.